The rain had been falling all afternoon, a steady drumbeat against the warped glass of my apartment windows. Seattle wore its gray shroud proudly today, the kind of weather that made you want to crawl under a blanket and forget the world existed. I sat at my desk, hunched over a laptop that hadn't seen a new word in hours, the cursor blinking like an accusation. Writer's block had become my unwanted houseguest, and I was running out of ways to evict it. The room smelled of damp wood and stale coffee, the remnants of my third cup sitting cold beside me. I barely noticed the sound at first, the faint scrape of a key in the lock. It was a familiar noise, one I'd heard 1,000 times over the past 5 years. Alice Moore, my housekeeper, always let herself in quietly, slipping through the apartment like a shadow I'd learned to take for granted. She was 65, a woman who carried her age with a kind of quiet dignity. Silver hair pulled into a neat bun, clothes plain but pristine, her movements precise and unobtrusive. She'd been a fixture in my life since Mom passed, a steady presence I relied on more than I cared to admit. But today, something was off. The key turned with a hesitation I wasn't used to, a slight tremble in the motion that made me lift my head. The door creaked open, and there she was, Alice, standing in the threshold, her coat glistening with raindrops. She didn't meet my eyes as she stepped inside, didn't offer her usual brisk "Good afternoon, Ethan." Instead, she moved past me toward the kitchen, her steps slower than normal, her shoulders tight beneath the damp fabric of her coat. I frowned, leaning back in my chair. "Rough day out there?" I called, trying to keep my tone light. She didn't answer. The rustle of grocery bags hitting the counter was the only reply, followed by a stillness that felt heavier than the rain outside. I waited, expecting her to start unpacking, to fill the silence with the clink of cans or the soft thud of a loaf of bread. But nothing came. "Alice," I said, louder this time, pushing my chair back. The scrape of wood on wood echoed in the quiet. I stood, curiosity tugging at me, mingled with something sharper, unease maybe. I crossed the room, my socked feet silent on the old hardwood, and paused at the edge of the hallway. She was standing by the door again, her back to me, one hand resting on the knob. For a moment, I thought she was about to leave without a word, something she'd never done before. But then I heard it, the sharp click of the lock sliding into place. My breath caught, a jolt of confusion spiking through me. Alice never locked the door when she worked. Never. Alice. My voice was quieter now, tentative. She turned slowly, and when her eyes met mine, I froze. Those pale blue eyes, usually so calm and detached, burned with something I couldn't name, intensity, resolve, maybe even fear. Her lips parted, but no sound came out at first. Then, in a voice low and steady, she said, "I need to show you something, Ethan." The words hung in the air, heavy as the rain-soaked clouds outside. My heart gave a hard thud against my ribs. I didn't know what she meant, but I knew one thing for sure: whatever happened next, it wasn't going to be ordinary. I stood there, rooted to the spot, as Alice's words sank in. The apartment felt smaller all of a sudden, the walls pressing in as the rain tapped a restless rhythm against the glass. She didn't move, didn't flinch, just watched me with that unreadable gaze. Her hand lingered on the locked door, like she was guarding it, or guarding me. "Show me what?" I managed, my voice rougher than I intended. I took a step toward her, then stopped, unsure if I was intruding on something I wasn't meant to see. Alice had always been a closed book, polite, efficient, invisible in her reliability. 5 years of her coming and going, tidying my chaos, brewing coffee that was somehow better than anything I could make, and I'd never once thought to ask who she really was. She was just Alice. But now, standing in the dim light of my hallway, she looked different. Her silver hair caught the faint glow from the kitchen, and the lines on her face, deepened by years I'd never bothered to question, seemed sharper, more alive. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached for the collar of her coat, her fingers trembling slightly as she unbuttoned it. The sound of each snap felt louder than it should have, a deliberate punctuation in the silence. "Alice, what's going on?" I asked, an edge of impatience creeping in. I wasn't scared, not yet, but the air was thick with something I couldn't place, and it was starting to crawl under my skin. She let the coat fall to the floor, a soft thud against the hardwood, and beneath it was something I'd never seen her wear, a black dress, simple but fitted, hugging her frame in a way that made her look not younger exactly, but more present. More real. It wasn't the shapeless sweaters or faded skirts she usually wore. This was intentional, a statement I didn't understand. Her eyes flicked to mine, searching for a reaction. "You've never noticed me, have you?" she said, her voice soft but piercing. "Not really." I opened my mouth to argue. "Of course I've noticed you, you're here every week," but the words died on my tongue. She was right. I'd seen her, sure, but I hadn't looked. Not at the way her hands moved when she folded my laundry, not at the faint smile she'd give when I muttered a distracted thanks. I'd let her blend into the background of my life, a ghost who kept things running while I drowned in my own mess. I started, but she raised a hand, cutting me off. Her fingers were steady now, no trace of the earlier tremble. "Don't," she said. "Just listen." She took a step closer, her shoes clicking faintly against the floor. My pulse jumped, a quick stutter in my chest. She was close enough now that I could smell the rain on her, mixed with something warmer. Lavender, maybe, faint but unmistakable. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Okay," I said, because what else could I say? I didn't know what was happening, but I couldn't look away. "Not now." She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor for a split second before locking back onto mine. "I've been here for years, Ethan. Watching you. Waiting." Her voice cracked on the last word, just enough to make me lean forward, drawn in despite myself. "And I'm tired of waiting." My mind raced, trying to catch up. Waiting for what? For me to notice her? For something to change? I didn't have answers, but the weight of her words pressed against me, heavy and urgent. I took a step closer, instinct, not thought, and her breath hitched, a sound so small I almost missed it. "What are you saying?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The space between us was shrinking, and I didn't know if I was the one moving or if she was. Maybe both. She didn't answer with words. Instead, she reached out, her fingers brushing my wrist. Just a graze light as a feather, but it sent a jolt through me like I'd touched a live wire. My breath caught, and I stared at her hand, at the fine lines etched into her skin, the faint tremble that betrayed her calm. She wasn't as steady as she wanted me to think. "Alice," I said, her name a question, a plea, a warning. I wasn't sure which. Her eyes softened, but there was fire in them too, a spark I'd never seen before. She stepped closer still, her hand sliding up my arm, firm now, deliberate. My skin burned under her touch, a heat that spread fast and deep, and I didn't pull away. "I'm not who you think I am," she whispered, so close I could feel the warmth of her breath against my jaw. "And neither are you." The rain pounded harder outside, a roar that drowned out the world. But in here, in this locked apartment, it was just us, and whatever this was, it was about to pull us under. The air in the apartment felt charged, like the moment before a lightning strike. Alice's hand lingered on my arm, her fingers pressing just hard enough to anchor me there, caught between confusion and something I didn't dare name. Her words echoed in my head, "I'm not who you think I am," and I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd missed something vital, something that had been right in front of me all along. I pulled back slightly, not breaking her grip but needing space to think. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice rough with the effort of keeping it steady. "Who are you then?" She didn't answer right away. Her hand slid away from my arm, leaving a trail of warmth that faded too quickly, and she turned toward the window. The rain streaked the glass in jagged lines, blurring the city beyond into a mess of gray and shadow. For a moment, she looked older, tired, maybe, or just worn down by whatever she was carrying. But when she spoke, her voice was firm, cutting through the quiet like a blade. "I've spent years being invisible," she said, her back still to me. "Not just to you. To everyone. But I can't do it anymore." I stared at her, at the sharp line of her shoulders under that black dress, and my mind scrambled to piece it together. 5 years. 5 years of her coming and going, tidying my life while I stumbled through deadlines and divorce papers. I'd never asked about her, where she lived, what she did when she wasn't here, who she'd been before she walked through my door. She was Alice, the woman who kept my world from falling apart. That was all I'd let her be. But now, standing here with the door locked and her eyes burning into mine, I realized how little I knew. And how much I suddenly wanted to. Alice, I said, stepping closer again, drawn in despite myself. Talk to me. Please. She turned then, and the look on her face stopped me cold. It wasn't anger or sadness. It was something deeper, a quiet resolve mixed with a flicker of fear. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, my phone buzzed on the desk, a harsh vibration that shattered the moment. I cursed under my breath and glanced at the screen. Lily's name flashed in bold letters. Hold on, I muttered, reaching for it. Alice's eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't protest as I swiped to answer. Ethan, where the hell are you? Lily's voice crackled through the line, sharp and impatient. I've been texting you for an hour. I'm home, I said, keeping my eyes on Alice. What's wrong? There was a pause, the kind Lily used when she was gearing up to say something I wouldn't like. It's about Alice. I found something in Mom's old stuff, letters, papers. Did you know she used to paint? Like, seriously paint. Galleries, exhibitions, the whole deal. I frowned, my grip tightening on the phone. What? No. She's never mentioned. Of course she hasn't, Lily cut in. She's weird, Ethan. Mom always said there was something off about her, like she was hiding stuff. I don't trust her around you. I glanced at Alice, who was watching me now, her expression unreadable. The black dress clung to her like a second skin, and I couldn't help but wonder what else I'd missed. Lily, this isn't a good time, I said, lowering my voice. Make it a good time, she snapped. Ask her about the letters. Ask her why she stopped painting. I'm telling you, there's more to her than she lets on. The line went dead before I could argue. I set the phone down, my head spinning. Alice tilted her head slightly, a faint crease forming between her brows. Your sister? She asked, her tone neutral but laced with something I couldn't place, amusement, maybe, or defiance. Yeah, I said, rubbing the back of my neck. She mentioned something about you. Painting. Letters. What's she talking about? For the first time since she'd locked the door, Alice looked unsettled. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she crossed her arms, the movement defensive but deliberate. Lily always did have a nose for trouble, she said, almost to herself. Then she met my eyes again, and the spark was back, brighter than before. You want to know who I am, Ethan? Fine. Sit down. I hesitated, then sank onto the edge of the couch, my heart thudding against my ribs. She didn't sit. Instead, she paced a slow circle in front of me, her heels clicking softly against the floor. The rain had eased into a gentle patter, a backdrop to the story she began to tell. I was an artist once, she said, her voice low and steady. 30 years ago, I had a studio in Portland, a little place filled with canvases and light. People said I had a gift, gallery owners, critics, even a few collectors. I painted what I felt, what I couldn't say. And I was good at it. I leaned forward, caught by the image of her, younger, vibrant, brush in hand. What happened? I asked. Her pacing stopped, and she turned to face me fully. I fell in love, she said simply. His name was Daniel. He was a writer, like you. Intense, quiet, always chasing something he couldn't quite catch. We were everything to each other. The air shifted, heavy with the weight of her words. I could hear the ache in her voice, the kind that didn't fade with time. Were? I asked, dreading the answer. She nodded, her gaze dropping to the floor. There was a fire. My studio, our studio. I'd left a candle burning, something stupid, careless. It spread so fast. Daniel didn't make it out. The silence that followed was suffocating. I wanted to say something. I'm sorry, that's awful, but the words felt hollow, useless. Alice lifted her head, her eyes glistening but dry. I stopped painting after that. Stopped living, really. I took jobs like this one, kept my head down. Until you. Me. My voice cracked, and I hated how small it sounded. You, she said, stepping closer. You reminded me of him. Not just the writing, the way you look at the world, like it owes you something you can't find. I saw it in you from the first day, and it woke something up. Something I thought was gone. My chest tightened, a mix of shock and heat I couldn't untangle. She was close now, close enough that I could see the faint lines around her eyes, the way her breath quickened as she spoke. I stood, drawn to my feet by some pull I didn't understand, and the space between us shrank to nothing. "Alice," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Why now?" She reached out, her fingers brushing my chest, just a touch light but electric, sending a shiver down my spine. "Because I'm tired of being a ghost," she said. "And I think you are too." I didn't move, couldn't move. Her hand rested there, warm against my shirt, and I felt my pulse hammering under her palm. The room spun, the rain a distant hum, and all I could see was her. Alice, the woman I'd never really known until this moment. Then the doorbell rang, a sharp, insistent buzz that sliced through the haze. I flinched, and Alice's hand dropped, her expression hardening. "Who's that?" she asked, her voice tight. I didn't know. But as I moved to the door, my stomach twisting with a sudden dread, I had a feeling this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The doorbell buzzed again, louder this time, like an angry wasp trapped in the walls. I froze halfway to the door, my hand hovering over the knob, Alice's words still ringing in my ears. "I'm tired of being a ghost." Her touch lingered on my chest, a phantom heat that made my skin prickle even now. I glanced back at her, and she stood rigid, her arms crossed tight, her eyes narrowed at the door like it was an intruder she could scare off with a look. "Whoever it is, they're not leaving," I muttered, more to myself than to her. My fingers closed around the knob, and I turned it, the lock clicking open with a sound that felt too final. The door swung wide, and there she was, Lily, my sister, soaked to the bone and glaring at me like I'd just committed a crime. "Jesus, Ethan, took you long enough," she snapped, shoving past me into the apartment. Her boots left wet prints on the hardwood, and her dark hair dripped onto the floor, a miniature rainstorm of her own making. She stopped short when she saw Alice, her eyes flicking over the black dress, the tense set of her shoulders. "Oh, you're still here." Alice didn't flinch. "I work here," she said, her voice cool and even, but there was an edge to it, a warning Lily didn't seem to hear. "Yeah, sure," Lily shot back, turning to me. "What's going on, Ethan? You look like you've seen a ghost." Her gaze darted between us, sharp and suspicious, and I felt a flush creep up my neck. She wasn't wrong, not entirely. "Nothing's going on," I said, too quickly. My hands shoved into my pockets, a reflex to hide the way they shook. "You didn't have to come all the way here, Lil. I told you I was fine." "Fine." She laughed, a short, bitter sound. "You're not fine. You're holed up with her," she jerked her chin at Alice. "And you don't even know what she's hiding. Did you ask about the letters? The fire?" Alice stiffened, her breath catching audibly. I turned to her, my stomach twisting. "What's she talking about, Alice? You said Daniel died in a fire, but what else?" Lily didn't give her a chance to answer. "Oh, she didn't tell you the whole story, did she?" She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a hiss. "I found Mom's old journals. She wrote about Alice, how she showed up after the fire, begging for a job. Mom felt sorry for her, but she didn't trust her. Said she was running from something. Said she started that fire." "That's enough," Alice cut in, her voice like a whip. She took a step forward, her hands uncrossing, fists clenched at her sides. "You don't know what you're talking about, Lily." "Don't I?" Lily shot back. "Then why'd you stop painting? Why'd you bury yourself in this?" She waved a hand at the apartment. "This sad little life. You're playing him, aren't you? Feeding him some sob story to get close." "Stop it," I said, my voice rising. I stepped between them, my chest tight with a mix of anger and confusion. "Both of you, just stop. Lily, you can't barge in here throwing accusations around. And Alice." I turned to her, searching her face for something, anything to hold on to. "Is she right? Did you cause it?" Alice's eyes met mine, and for a moment, I thought she'd turn away, shut me out like she'd done for years. But then she exhaled, a shaky breath that seemed to pull the fight out of her. "It was an accident," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "A candle. I didn't know it would spread. Daniel was asleep, and I I couldn't get to him in time. The words hit me like a punch, raw and jagged. I could see it in her face, the guilt, the weight she'd carried all these years. Lily snorted, crossing her arms. Convenient story. And now you're what? Latching onto my brother because he's broken too. Lily, get out, I snapped, my patience gone. Now. She stared at me, her mouth open, then shook her head. Fine. But don't say I didn't warn you. Ask her about the paintings she burned, Ethan. Ask her what she's really after. She grabbed her bag and stormed out, slamming the door so hard the walls rattled. The silence that followed was deafening. The rain had stopped, leaving only the faint drip of water from the eaves outside. I turned to Alice, my head spinning. Paintings she burned? What's she mean? Alice sank onto the edge of the couch, her hands twisting in her lap. After the fire, she said, I couldn't look at my work. Every canvas, every sketch, it was all tied to him. So I destroyed them, piled them in the yard and set them alight. I didn't want to feel anything anymore. I sat beside her, close enough that our knees nearly touched. And now? I asked, my voice softer. What do you want now? She looked at me then, her eyes wide and unguarded, and the air between us shifted again, thicker, heavier. You, she said, so quietly I almost missed it. I've wanted you to see me for so long, Ethan. Not the housekeeper. Me. My breath hitched, and before I could stop myself, I reached for her hand. Her fingers were cold, trembling slightly, but they curled around mine like they belonged there. I felt the jolt again, that same electric pull from before, stronger now, racing up my arm and settling deep in my chest. Alice, I said, my voice rough with something I couldn't name. I see you. She leaned closer, her shoulder brushing mine, and I felt the heat of her, the faint scent of lavender cutting through the damp air. Her free hand lifted, hesitant, then rested against my chest, right where my heart hammered beneath my shirt. My pulse jumped under her touch, and I couldn't look away, not from her eyes, not from the way her lips parted, soft and uncertain. I shouldn't, she whispered, but her hand didn't move. It's not right. Then why does it feel like it is? I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. I covered her hand with mine, pressing it harder against me, and her breath caught, a small, sharp sound that sent a shiver down my spine. We were close now, too close, the space between us shrinking with every heartbeat. Her fingers tightened, digging into my shirt, and I felt the tension in her, the fight between what she wanted and what she thought she shouldn't have. I leaned in, drawn by that pull, by the fire in her eyes, and her head tilted toward me, her breath warm against my jaw. Ethan, she murmured, a plea or a warning, I couldn't tell. Her hand slid up to my shoulder, gripping tight, and I felt the tremor in her fingers, the way her body leaned into mine despite herself. The world narrowed to this, to her touch, her heat, the quiet sound of her breathing. I didn't care about Lily, about the past, about anything but the woman in front of me. My hand moved to her cheek, my thumb brushing the soft skin there, and she closed her eyes, a shaky exhale escaping her lips. We were on the edge, teetering, and I knew, one move, one word and we'd fall. The apartment was too quiet after Lily left, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes every small sound feel like a shout. Alice's hand still rested on my shoulder, her fingers curled into the fabric of my shirt, and I could feel the faint tremble in them, the echo of her confession hanging between us. My thumb lingered on her cheek, tracing the fine lines there, and her eyes fluttered open, meeting mine with a mix of vulnerability and defiance. We shouldn't be doing this, she said again, but her voice was softer now, less certain. Her hand didn't move, and neither did mine. Then why aren't you stopping? I asked, my tone low, almost a challenge. I shifted closer, my knee brushing hers, and the contact sent a spark through me, sharp and insistent. Her breath hitched and I saw it, the flicker of something raw in her eyes, something she'd buried for years but couldn't hide now. I don't know, she whispered, her fingers tightening on my shoulder. I don't know how to stop. The words hit me hard, stirring something deep in my chest. Want, maybe, or need, or just the ache of recognizing someone else's pain as my own. I'd been numb for so long, drifting through deadlines and empty nights since the divorce, that I'd forgotten what it felt like to feel this much. But Alice, she'd cracked something open, and I wasn't sure I wanted it closed again. Before I could say anything, she pulled back, her hand slipping from my shoulder to her lap. The sudden distance felt like a slap, and I blinked, trying to steady myself. She stood, smoothing her dress with shaky hands, and turned toward the kitchen. "I need water," she said, her voice tight. "I need a minute." I watched her go, my pulse still racing, my skin buzzing where she touched me. The air felt colder without her near, and I leaned back against the couch, running a hand through my hair. What the hell was happening? 5 years of routine, of polite nods and quiet mornings, and now this, her locking doors, spilling secrets, looking at me like I was more than just the guy who paid her checks. And me, letting it happen. Wanting it too. The clink of a glass against the counter pulled me out of my head. Alice stood by the sink, her back to me, sipping water with a focus that felt forced. I got up, drawn to her again, and stopped a few feet away. "You okay?" I asked, softer than I meant to. She didn't turn around. "No," she said, setting the glass down with a quiet thud. "I haven't been okay in a long time." I took a step closer, close enough to see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands gripped the edge of the sink. "You don't have to tell me everything," I said. "But Lily, she's not wrong about one thing. There's more, isn't there?" She laughed, a small, bitter sound. "Your sister's got a knack for digging up bones. Yes, there's more. There's always more." She turned then, her eyes sharp and bright. "But it's not what she thinks. I'm not here to use you, Ethan. I'm not some schemer spinning a web." "Then why are you here?" I pressed, my voice rising. "Why now? Why this?" I gestured between us, the space crackling with whatever we'd started, after all these years. She stepped toward me, closing the gap again, and I felt my breath catch. "Because I couldn't anymore," she said, her voice fierce. "I couldn't keep pretending I didn't feel it. Every time I walked in here, every time you looked through me, I felt it. And I know you did too." I stared at her, my mind reeling. Had I? I thought back, her quiet presence, the way her fingers brushed mine when she handed me coffee, the rare times I'd caught her watching me when she thought I wasn't looking. Little moments I'd brushed off, buried under the weight of my own mess. But now, with her standing here, her eyes locked on mine, I couldn't deny it. There'd been something, small, fleeting, but real. "Alice," I started, but she shook her head, cutting me off. "Don't," she said. "Don't say it's crazy or wrong or impossible. I know all that. I've told myself 1,000 times. But I'm done lying, to myself, to you." I didn't know what to say, so I didn't say anything. Instead, I reached for her again, my hand finding hers, and she didn't pull away. Her fingers laced through mine, tight and desperate, and I felt the heat of her palm, the rapid pulse at her wrist. My other hand moved to her arm, sliding up to her shoulder, and she stepped into me, her body inches from mine. "Ethan," she murmured, her voice trembling now, "if we do this." "I know," I said, my thumb brushing her collarbone, feeling the shiver that ran through her. "I know." Her hand lifted to my chest again, pressing hard, and I felt my own heartbeat thudding against her palm. She tilted her head up, her lips close, too close, and I could feel her breath warm and uneven against my skin. My hand slid to the back of her neck, fingers tangling in the soft strands of her hair, and she leaned into me, her body pressing against mine in a way that made my head spin. We didn't kiss, not yet, but the air between us was alive, electric, every touch a spark threatening to ignite. Her fingers dug into my shirt, pulling me closer, and I felt the tension in her, the fight she was losing. My arm tightened around her, holding her there, and she let out a soft sound, a sigh, a plea, that sent a jolt straight through me. Then my phone buzzed again, loud and insistent, on the coffee table. We both froze, the moment shattering like glass. I cursed under my breath, pulling back just enough to glance at it. Lily's name again. Alice's hand dropped, and she stepped away, her face flushed, her breathing ragged. "Don't answer it," she said, her voice low but firm. "Not now." I hesitated, my hand hovering over the phone. But then I saw something on the table, a small, weathered envelope tucked under a stack of bills, one I hadn't noticed before. It was old, yellowed, with my mother's handwriting scrawled across the front, for Ethan. My stomach dropped. What's that? Alice asked, following my gaze. Her tone shifted, sharper now, wary. I picked it up, my fingers trembling as I tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, dated 10 years ago, the ink faded but legible. My mother's words stared back at me, cold and clear. Ethan, if you're reading this, it's because Alice stayed longer than I thought she would. She's not what she seems, not dangerous, but broken. I hired her after the fire, after she lost everything. She painted me once, you know, a portrait she burned with the rest. She's tied to us, to you, more than you'll ever understand. Be careful. I looked up at Alice, my throat tight. What does this mean? I asked, holding the letter out. Tied to me? What didn't you tell me? Her face paled, and for the first time, she looked genuinely afraid. Ethan, she stopped, her hands twisting together. Your mother. She knew Daniel. She was there the night it happened. She tried to help me after, gave me a job, a purpose. I didn't tell you because... Because what? I pressed, stepping closer, the letter crumpling in my fist. What else are you keeping from me? She met my eyes, her voice barely a whisper. Because I didn't want you to hate me. The room spun, the weight of her words crashing down. My mother, Alice, Daniel. The pieces didn't fit, not yet, but they were there, jagged and sharp. And through it all, I still felt her. Her touch, her heat, the pull that hadn't faded even now. Tell me everything, I said, my voice hard. Now. Alice stared at the crumpled letter in my hand, her face pale and drawn, like she'd seen a ghost she couldn't outrun. The apartment felt smaller than ever, the walls closing in as the weight of my mother's words sank deeper. She's tied to us, to you, more than you'll ever understand. I didn't move, didn't let go of her gaze, my voice steady despite the storm churning inside me. Tell me, I said again, slower this time, each word a demand. Everything. She took a shaky breath, her hands twisting together like she was trying to hold herself together. I didn't want it to come to this, she said, her voice low and raw. I didn't want you to know me like this, broken, messy. But I guess there's no hiding anymore. She turned away, walking to the window where the last traces of rain streaked the glass, her reflection faint against the dark. I stayed where I was, the letter burning in my fist, waiting. When she spoke again, her tone was distant, like she was pulling the story from a place she'd locked away. Your mother, Clara. She wasn't just my employer, Ethan. She was my friend. 30 years ago, before the fire, before everything fell apart. She knew Daniel, too. They'd met through me, back when I was still painting, still alive. Clara loved art, loved what I could do with a brush. She'd come to my studio sometimes, sit with us while I worked. Daniel would read his drafts aloud, and she'd laugh, tell him he'd be famous one day. I blinked, trying to picture it. My mother, younger, vibrant, in a room full of paint and words. It didn't fit the woman I'd known, the quiet, practical one who'd raised me and Lily. She never told me, I said, my voice tight. Not about you, not about any of it. Alice nodded, her eyes fixed on the glass. She wouldn't. After the fire, she changed. We both did. That night, it was late, raining like this. Daniel and I were in the studio. I'd been working on a portrait of your mother, something she'd begged me to paint. I left a candle burning near the curtains. Stupid, careless. I didn't think. Her voice cracked, and she pressed a hand to her mouth, steadying herself. I stepped closer, drawn in despite the ache in my chest. Go on, I said, softer now. She swallowed hard, her hand dropping. It caught fast. Too fast. Daniel was asleep on the couch. He'd been up all night writing. I tried to wake him, tried to pull him out, but the smoke. It was everywhere. Clara showed up. She'd been driving by, saw the flames. She ran in, helped me get out, but Daniel, he didn't make it. Her shoulders shook, a silent sob she wouldn't let free. I moved without thinking, closing the distance between us, my hand resting on her arm. She flinched but didn't pull away, and I felt the tension in her, the years of guilt coiled tight. Clara blamed herself, Alice continued, her voice barely audible. Said she should have gotten there sooner, should have dragged him out. I told her it was my fault. My candle, my mistake. We fought about it, screamed at each other in the wreckage. After that, I burned everything. My paintings, my life. I couldn't face it. Clara tracked me down a year later, offered me a job. Said she wouldn't let me disappear. I stared at her, the pieces clicking into place. My mother's quiet sadness, the way she'd deflect when I asked about her past. Why didn't she tell me? I asked, my grip tightening on her arm. Why keep you a secret? Alice turned to me then, her eyes wet but fierce. Because she saw you in me, the way you shut down after she died, after your divorce. She thought I could help you, keep you from fading like I did. And I tried, Ethan. I stayed, watched you, waited. But it wasn't just about her anymore. Her words hit me like a wave, pulling me under. I let go of her arm, stepping back, my head spinning. What are you saying? I asked, though I already knew, felt it in the way my pulse raced, the way her presence filled the room. She stepped closer, erasing the space I'd made, her hand lifting to my chest again. I'm saying I fell for you, she said, her voice trembling but sure. Somewhere along the way, every coffee I made, every time you smiled without meaning to, I fell. And I couldn't stop it. My breath caught, her touch searing through my shirt, and I felt it too, the pull I'd ignored, the spark I'd buried. Alice, I started, but she shook her head, her fingers pressing harder. Don't, she said. Don't tell me it's wrong. I know it is, age, time, everything. But tell me you don't feel it too. I couldn't. Because I did, every nerve alive with it, every heartbeat screaming it. My hand moved to her face, cupping her cheek, and she leaned into me, her eyes closing as a shaky breath escaped her. I feel it, I said, my voice rough. God help me, I do. She opened her eyes, and the distance between us vanished. Her hands slid up my chest, gripping my shoulders, and I pulled her closer, my arm wrapping around her waist. Our bodies pressed together, her warmth against me, and I felt her tremble, not from fear, but from the same fire burning in me. My fingers tangled in her hair, tilting her head back, and her lips parted close, too close to mine. Ethan, she whispered, her breath hot against my skin, her hands tightening on me like she was afraid I'd slip away. I could feel her heartbeat through her dress, fast and unsteady, matching mine. I leaned in, my forehead resting against hers, and the world narrowed to this, to her scent, her touch, the quiet sound of her breathing. Tell me to stop, I said, my voice a growl, my hand sliding down her back, pulling her tighter. I can't, she said, her voice breaking. I don't want to. That was it, the dam breaking, the line crossed. My lips found hers, soft at first, tentative, but then harder, desperate, like we'd both been starving for this. She kissed me back with the same hunger, her hands clutching my shirt, pulling me closer. I felt the heat of her, the way her body molded to mine, every touch a spark that lit me up inside. My arm tightened around her, lifting her slightly, and she gasped against my mouth, a sound that drove me wild. We stumbled back, her back hitting the wall, and I pressed against her, my hands framing her face, her fingers digging into my shoulders. It wasn't gentle, it was raw, urgent, years of silence pouring out in every kiss, every touch. Her breath came in short, ragged bursts, and I felt the tremor in her, the way she surrendered to it, to us. But then she pulled back, just enough to look at me, her eyes wide and searching. Ethan, she said, her voice hoarse, what are we doing? I rested my forehead against hers again, my chest heaving, my hands still on her face. I don't know, I said, honest and wrecked. But I don't want to stop. She closed her eyes, a tear slipping free, and her hands slid down my arms, gripping my wrists. Neither do I, she whispered. But we have to think, Lily, your mother, all of it. I nodded, my thumb brushing the tear away, but I didn't let go. Tomorrow, I said. We'll figure it out tomorrow. She looked at me, her lips swollen, her face flushed, and nodded back. Tomorrow. But as we stood there, tangled in each other, the rain picking up again outside, I knew, tomorrow wouldn't change this. Whatever we'd started, it was too deep, too real, to walk away from now. The apartment was silent when I woke up, the kind of quiet that feels wrong after a storm. My head throbbed, a dull ache from too little sleep and too much everything else, and the couch beneath me creaked as I shifted. The memory of last night hit me like a freight train. Alice's lips on mine, her hands clutching me, the way we'd burned through years of distance in a single reckless moment. I pressed my palms to my eyes, trying to steady the chaos in my chest, but it wouldn't settle. I sat up, scanning the room. The kitchen was empty, the glass she'd used still sitting by the sink, a faint ring of water around its base. Her coat was gone from the floor, the door unlocked. She'd left. No note, no sound, just gone, like she'd never been here at all. My stomach twisted, a mix of relief and something sharper. Loss maybe, or fear that I'd dreamed it. Alice. I called, my voice hoarse, but the silence answered back. I stood, my legs unsteady, and checked the hallway, the bathroom, nothing. She'd slipped out sometime after I'd dozed off, after we'd pulled apart and promised tomorrow. I rubbed my chest where her hand had been, the ghost of her touch still lingering, and cursed under my breath. What had I expected? That she'd stay, that we'd wake up and figure this out over coffee like it was normal? I grabbed my phone from the coffee table, 3 missed calls from Lily, a string of texts I didn't bother reading. I tossed it aside and sank back onto the couch, my eyes landing on the crumpled letter from Mom. It sat there, accusing, its edges worn from my grip. She's tied to us, to you. The words gnawed at me, and I reached for it, smoothing it out, rereading every line. Clara had known Alice, really known her, and I'd been too wrapped up in my own life to see it. A glint of something caught my eye, peeking out from under the stack of bills where the letter had been. I pulled it free, a small, folded piece of canvas, edges charred and brittle. My breath caught as I unfolded it carefully, revealing a fragment of a painting. It was a face, half-finished, the brushstrokes bold and alive despite the damage. Dark hair, sharp jaw, eyes that pierced even in their incompleteness. It was me, or someone who looked like me. My hands shook as I stared at it, the realization sinking in. Alice had painted this. Not 30 years ago, not of Daniel. This was recent, hidden, a secret she'd kept until now. I stood, clutching the canvas, my mind racing. She'd been watching me, feeling this long before last night. Long enough to capture me in paint she swore she'd abandoned. The thought sent a shiver through me, equal parts awe and unease. I needed to find her, to understand what this meant, what we meant. The rain had stopped, leaving the city damp and glistening as I stepped outside. Alice lived a few blocks away. Mom had mentioned it once, an old house she rented near the park. I didn't know the exact address, but I'd seen her walking that way enough times to guess. My boots splashed through puddles, my breath fogging in the cool air, and my heart pounded with every step. I didn't know what I'd say, didn't know what I wanted, just that I had to see her. The house was small, weathered, its porch sagging under a tangle of ivy. A light glowed in the window, faint but steady, and I stopped at the gate, my hand hovering over the latch. The painting was tucked in my jacket, pressing against my chest like a second heartbeat. I took a breath, pushed the gate open, and climbed the steps, my fist pausing an inch from the door. Before I could knock, it swung open, and there she was, Alice, her hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes wide with surprise. She wore a faded sweater, not the black dress, but the fire in her gaze was the same. "Ethan," she said, her voice a mix of shock and something softer. Relief, maybe. "What are you doing here?" I pulled the canvas from my jacket, holding it out. "This," I said, my voice rough. "You painted me." Her face paled, her hand reaching for it but stopping short. She swallowed, her eyes flicking to mine. "I didn't mean for you to find it. Not like this." "When?" I asked, stepping closer, the porch creaking under my weight. "When did you do it?" "Last year," she said, her voice barely audible. "After you stayed up all night writing, ranting about your book. You didn't see me watching, didn't see how you looked. I hadn't painted in decades, but I couldn't stop myself. It was like you brought it back." I stared at her, the weight of it crashing over me, her seeing me, really seeing me when I'd been blind to her. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, my hand tightening on the canvas. "Why hide it?" "Because I was afraid," she said, stepping onto the porch, closing the gap. "Afraid you'd think I was crazy, or worse, pathetic. An old woman clinging to something she can't have." You're not, I said, my voice firm. You're not pathetic. And I'm here, aren't I? She looked at me, her eyes searching mine, and the air between us thickened again, heavy with everything we'd left unsaid. Ethan, she said, her hand lifting to my chest, resting there like it belonged. What do we do now? I covered her hand with mine, pressing it harder, feeling my pulse jump under her touch. I don't know, I said, honest and raw. But I'm not walking away. Not after last night. Her breath hitched, and she stepped closer, her body brushing mine. Neither am I, she said, her voice trembling but sure. Her other hand lifted to my face, her fingers tracing my jaw, and I felt the heat of her, the pull I couldn't fight. I leaned in, my arm sliding around her waist, pulling her against me, and she didn't resist, didn't want to. Our foreheads touched, her breath warm against my lips, and I felt her tremble, her hands gripping me tighter. This is a mess, she whispered, a faint laugh breaking through. You know that, right? Yeah, I said, my lips brushing hers, not quite a kiss but close enough to make my head spin. But it's ours. She smiled, a small, real smile, and her fingers slid into my hair, pulling me down. Our lips met again, softer this time, slower, but no less intense. I held her close, my hands firm on her back, feeling the way she melted into me, the quiet sound she made against my mouth. It wasn't rushed now, it was deliberate, a choice we'd both made, messy and complicated and real. When we pulled apart, breathless, she rested her head against my chest, her arms around me. Lily's going to kill us, she murmured, and I laughed, the sound rough but free. Let her try, I said, my chin resting on her head. We'll figure it out. We stood there, tangled together on her porch, the city quiet around us. I didn't know what came next. Lily's anger, the past we'd have to face, the world that wouldn't understand. But as I held her, the painting pressed between us, I knew one thing, this wasn't the end. It was a beginning, uncertain and wild, and I wasn't letting go. The days after that night on Alice's porch blurred into a strange, quiet rhythm. We didn't talk about it much, what we'd done, what it meant, just let it sit between us, heavy and real, like a stone smoothed by a river. I'd go to her place some evenings, or she'd come to mine, and we'd move around each other with a kind of cautious ease. Coffee in the morning, her pouring while I scribbled notes for a book I might actually finish. Her hand brushing mine when she passed me a mug, my fingers lingering on hers a second too long. Small moments, fragile but growing, like roots pushing through cracked earth. Lily hadn't called since her last text, a curt "you're an idiot, Ethan," and I didn't reach out either. She'd come around, or she wouldn't. I wasn't ready to face her fire, not when mine was still burning so close to the surface. The painting stayed on my coffee table, a silent witness to whatever this was, its charred edges a reminder of Alice's past, and maybe mine too. I caught her looking at it sometimes, her eyes distant, but she never said a word about picking up a brush again. I didn't push. It was a Thursday, gray and damp, when I found myself back at her house. The air smelled of wet leaves and wood smoke, Seattle settling into its autumn skin. She'd left the door unlocked, her quiet way of saying I was welcome, and I stepped inside, shaking rain from my jacket. The living room was warm, a lamp casting soft light over the worn furniture, and I heard her in the kitchen, the clink of dishes a familiar sound. "Ethan," she called, her voice carrying that note of surprise she still hadn't shaken, like she couldn't quite believe I'd keep showing up. "Yeah," I said, hanging my jacket on the hook by the door. "Brought you something." She stepped into the doorway, wiping her hands on a towel, her hair loose and silver in the light. "What is it?" she asked, her lips curving into a small, curious smile. I pulled a book from my bag, a battered copy of The Bell Jar, one I'd found at a used shop downtown. "Thought you might like it," I said, holding it out. "You mentioned Sylvia Plath once, back when I was complaining about writer's block. Figured it was time I paid attention."